Hello, my name's Steve Haynes and I'm the co-author of this book, How to Go to Work, the honest advice no one ever tells you at the start of your career. And in these bite-sized sessions for Beckett careers, I'll be going through some of the essential tools and tips that you need to make a great start in working life. And in this session, we're looking at my favourite, or possibly least favourite, of the topics, impossible situations at work and what to do about them. Now, I think we're getting much more comfortable in work and in society to look at some of the challenges and do some of the learning we need along the way when things go wrong. It's all too tempting to see the final polished result and not realise what happened in the lead up to it. And like in every other part of life, there'll be days when things just don't go that well. And whilst you can't stop having bad days, you can certainly get better at them. And I'm going to share a few of the ideas that I've gathered along my working life and in speaking to many employers and people who've been exactly where you are now, to be able to share some of those useful hints that will help you navigate those difficult situations. We're going to look a bit at what to do when things go wrong. What do you do in the moment? We'll talk a bit about how you can learn from those difficult situations as well. I also want to do a bit about understanding what we mean by failure and why it's important to understand what I call the spectrum of failure and where you fit on that when things do go wrong. We'll look a bit at teams. So much of your working life is about working together in teams, and that can be a positive thing, and it also can be a source of what happens when things go wrong as well, and how to spot those problems before they become too big to manage. And the last thing we'll look at is your well-being, because actually how you feel in the workplace will mean a huge amount to how you deal with those difficult situations. So we'll look at some of the things that you need to have in place to make sure you have a good working life. The reality is that so much stuff goes wrong. You might well find yourself in a difficult situation, a project that you're responsible for, a task that you were supposed to have delivered, an operation that you needed to complete, and it hasn't happened. What do you do? Well, firstly, it's about recognising what's going on. Make sure you're not too busy and absorbed in the immediate task to spot things as they start to become more and more risky. Instead, make sure that you've got your eye on all those different parts of the project that could go wrong and actively thinking about risk as you go forward in your work. Really important to do as soon as possible is tell somebody, raise the alarm, make sure people know what's going wrong. It's more important than trying to cover your tracks, than trying to pretend that the failure isn't happening. It's only going to grow and it's going to get more difficult. So if you can fix the situation in the moment, great, go for it. But otherwise, tell people what's going wrong. Always work together to try and solve the problem. It's going to be much easier if your boss or your colleagues know what's going on and how to help. This is why it's really important to do things like sharing drafts of your work or updating on progress. You might be used to being given an assignment at university and having to do it all yourself, or maybe in a small group, and the task has been clear. It's been taken away, it's been assessed, and you've been given a result at the end. It's not the same in work. Things are happening all the time. Multiple things are happening. You're possibly working across different projects. New things are arising, decisions are being made, and actually the nature of the work, the outcome that it's expected, is changing too. And so you're going to have a really different way of working to be able to find out how to get the best result. So work together on the solution. Don't try and blame anybody else, even if you feel like it is somebody else's fault. Often you'll have a contractor or a member of another team who's responsible for delivering something on time, and maybe they haven't, or maybe they've delivered the wrong thing, or it's not what you expected, or it's not to the quality of what was needed, and that's upset everything else that's going on. It's really important to take responsibility for the situation rather than just put the blame somewhere else. It's reflecting on you much better if you're getting on top of it and doing something about it. Then I'd say take a note of what's going on. It's really tempting in the moment to just be fixing and furiously trying to make sure that everything goes right again, and time is often of the essence. But as far as possible, try and take a note of what's happening. And we'll come back to that in a moment, to how you review things. Because the last thing I'd say is learn. Learn with other people as far as possible and make sure you're building that reflection time yourself. Here's a little tool that I often use which helps out. It's called a W3. First W you need to look at is what went well. Again, in a difficult situation, it can be tempting to think what went wrong and jump straight to that and think what you might do differently next time as a result. And take a breath and think about all the things that did go well. That's going to be really important for your well-being later. You won't feel like you're surrounded by failure, but instead, lots and lots of things did go well. Maybe certain things were delivered on time. Maybe the result isn't perfect, but it's pretty good, and actually the customer, the client, feels pretty satisfied with it. Maybe you found the opportunity to do some learning as you went as well, and that's been an important part of your starting out at work. So think about all the things that did go well first, and try and be disciplined to just think about these things before you leap into what went wrong. Because you've got plenty of time to do that, the second of your W's is, well, what didn't go well? And think more broadly as well, what about the things that didn't go well that weren't necessarily the cause of this difficult situation you find yourself in? What were the kind of near misses that you had along the way? It's going to be just as important to document them and think about those things, because it's very likely you'll be doing that process, that project again. So if you made a good note of what nearly went wrong, that's going to really help you, as well as those things that didn't go as well as you liked, and certainly the things that went really wrong we've had to fix. Lastly, I'd say, what would you do differently next time? It might be that you start to understand the risks a bit more. Maybe in that example with your dependency on another team or another provider, you've planned in advance, you've been clear on your expectations. Do a long list of those and learn together. And across those 3 W questions, you'll get a really good sense of how to do things differently next time. If you take a note of it, something like an annually recurring event or a project when you come to repeat it, you can pick out those notes and look back over them again. And by doing that, you'll be reducing significantly the chances of failure. Hugely important. But wait a minute, I did say I'd talk a bit about what's the spectrum of failure, because actually it's tempting to think that all things are bad and failures are wrong. They're not. A few years back, the Harvard Business Review did a whole edition about failure. And it said that there are loads of different ways to deal with problems and loads of different ways to manage them. And the best thing to do is to look at what they call the spectrum of failure. So let's look at this. On the one hand, you've got process compliance. Now, let's imagine you're in a factory and you're making iced buns, and somebody's responsible for baking the dough and putting the raisins in, and it comes along a little conveyor belt, and then somebody's responsible for icing the bun, and your job is to put the cherry on top before it goes off to be packed and distributed. Well, let's imagine you're working away several hours of putting these cherries on top of these buns, and you get a phone call, or somebody distracts your attention, or you drop something on the floor, and one of those buns goes past without a cherry on top. Oh dear, that's a failure. That's something that's gone wrong, but that's process compliance. Now, hopefully you've got another link in the chain later in the process, which is quality assurance, so that cherry can be rectified. And what do you do? Well, you say sorry. You say sorry once, leave it at that, and carry on with your cherries on top of the next buns. What about then the next layer of that, which might be across the spectrum, not having the right tools or the skills to do the job? Maybe the process itself has got a problem with it. Maybe the protocols surrounding something aren't quite working. And many factories, service providers, hospitals, schools, businesses spend all their time gradually learning and improving on their processes, especially when new things arise. Now, one of the things you can do here is make sure that you're thinking ahead to what tools and skills you'll need to be able to do the job. Make sure that you've got a supervisor of some kind supporting you in those first tasks. But imagine there's an emergency. You're working for a plumbing company and a leak has sprung up in the middle of the road and it's stopped all the traffic, and you need to go and fix it. And you turn up and you find, well, this isn't actually something you've ever done before. You're an apprentice, you're trying to work your way through the role, and you're not familiar with these kind of emergency repairs to big pipes like the ones under the road, and you've got a tiny spanner with you. This is a process problem, but it's not a process compliance problem. You've done your best, but the wider failure has been caused by a lack of learning skills or tools to do the job. Then it looks at hypothesis testing. One of the things that I really heard speaking to all the employers that we spoke to when we were writing the book was their disappointments, or perhaps amazements, that with all of these fantastic new talented people coming into their organisation, very few were prepared to take risks, come up with big ideas, think differently about how things can be done. And you've got a wonderful opportunity to do a bit of hypothesis testing. Remember, you're full of enthusiasm and new experiences and different perspectives, and you are fresh out of education, unlike the vast majority of your colleagues in the organisation. So have a good conversation with your boss and your team about how you might want to make things work a bit differently, new things you could try. And with their support and their acceptance of the idea, you've got a wonderful opportunity to do a lot of hypothesis testing. In that comfortable environment where they know you're dependable, where they've given you the security to be able to test and implement new things, there's loads of stuff you can discover, and it could be definitely to the benefit of you, your team, and your business in terms of delivering those new outcomes. That's really exciting. So dedicate a bit of your time to hypothesis testing and get comfortable with things not working. Lastly, there's a cultural point, I think, in there as well, which is that some organisations are more used to taking risk than others. Some manage risks in different ways. Some expect you to buy people in, to get people convinced of the idea and the change you're wanting to bring about, rather than just get on with it. So just do a little cultural check to make sure your hypothesis testing is going to work well and go forward within that organisation. Last thing I'd say is there's some points where you just want to actually fail. A friend of mine was working on the secondary effects of the COVID vaccine, and he literally was there, as some of you who are scientists will know, with the pipette and the test tube day after day, testing thousands and thousands of variables. He wanted to make sure that people with certain long-term health conditions or of different age groups or living in different contexts weren't going to get adversely affected by the vaccine. And so he progressively and successfully failed over and over again. In fact, it can be a job to make sure that something doesn't happen rather than does. Now, when you start to think about failure in this broader spectrum, you've got much more of an idea about how you can learn. And you've got much more of an idea about where the source of that failure came from and what you would do differently next time. Let's look a bit now at teams and why this is really important, because actually the climate in which you're working really matters too. There's a great quote from a business author who talked about what he said was level 5 leadership. These were the people who were the best bosses. And he said they look in the mirror for criticism and they look out the window for praise. You know you're in a great situation when your boss is not constantly picking up what went wrong, but actually helping you learn. And also where you're in a team that shares praise. Be part of that. Don't always take the credit for everything that goes right, and don't always rest on your shoulders the weight of things going wrong. You're part of a team, and you should be working together through success and failure, sharing credit and taking responsibility. And a good boss will always make sure of that. I know that's not always the case. There are real hallmarks of teams not working well. Sometimes you want a competitive environment in sales, for example, but quite often you want to make sure that the whole team shares that sense of success. And if you don't feel like that, that might be a problem. I mentioned about blame shifting earlier, the fact that you should take responsibility. Well, is your boss blaming you a bit too often? And that's a real sign that things aren't good either. So always make sure you're thinking about the team that you're working in and the wider context. And the best teams, and there's a great study by Google with a project they call Project Aristotle about this, share praise, are dependable on each other, and make sure that everybody feels safe to come up with ideas or to say, hey, that went wrong, that's all I can do, and can you help? So always look after your well-being, make sure you're in a great climate and environment for you to thrive. Give yourself time to learn and reflect. That's going to be really important. Make sure you aren't overloading and stressing yourself out and forcing those failures to happen. And most of all, spend time on resting and recouping, getting some good sleep, getting some exercise, and that will really help you manage those difficult situations at work. As I say, you can't always avoid them, but you definitely can get good at them. If you'd like to find out more, you've got an extraordinary resource with Beckett Careers. Just go to myhub.leedsbeckett.ac.uk, and there you'll find a wealth of information, advice and guidance. There are skills workshops that you can attend, there are vacancies, there are employer advice sessions, and most of all you've got the opportunity to have those in-depth conversations with the careers consultants. So do take the opportunity to look at all that information, advice and guidance. It will be undoubtedly hugely helpful to you, whatever stage you're at in your career.